Hi guys, it's John from Lothian Fishkeepers here. It's Thursday night again, and we've got another live chat with our friend Dave Poole from Fish Science. Tonight, our subject is going to be all about feeding. One of the members of the Lothian Fishkeepers admin team, who was going to join us this evening, but unfortunately he can't make it, he chose the subject of tonight's discussion, which was really focusing on things like how to feed your food, how to feed your fish correctly, is there the right time, regularity, that sort of thing. And I know Dave, having a long history in fish food at Fish Science, and also from previous companies as well, he's probably the best person in the UK to discuss this subject with. So if you've been tuning in before, you'll know who Dave is. He's the owner of Fish Science, and a great friend, and credit to the fish community up and down the UK, and soon to be across the world. So over to you, Dave.
Yeah, well, good evening, everyone. Or good, I guess some people will be watching us and listening in other countries, so it's probably good morning there. But yeah, this evening will be really interesting because we've got some questions that have come in on feeding fish, and it's a great topic. It can be as simple or as complicated as you want to make it. So if anybody's got any questions, just fire them in, and I'll do my best to answer them, or John will do his best to answer them. Between us, we can certainly cover most of the questions that will be raised. And if we can't, then what we can do is make a note of them and come back to you next week when we've got another of the live streams.
Yeah, we're always open for new questions and new topics. So yeah, like you said, if you've got anything that you wanted to bring up, just get in touch with us, and we'll be happy to roll it out the next week.
Fantastic. So on to feeding. I mean, it's obviously it's a topic that's of interest to me, as Fish Science is a company that I started a short time ago, and before that I worked for about 25 years with Tetra, and fish food has been sort of central to what my involvement in the fish hobby, and not just fish food, but a significant part of making food work is making sure that people use them correctly and provide advice on what to feed, when to feed, how to feed, and also what not to feed. So hopefully we can cover all of that. So John, you've got some questions.
I have, yeah. First question that I was going to start off with is really, is it a best time to feed your fish?
Yeah, again, a great question. In terms of when you feed the fish, I would say 9 times out of 10, I would feed them when it's suitable for you, because your main interaction with your fish, apart from watching them, is actually feeding them, and watching them feed, and watching the different behaviors when they feed, and the interactions between the fish when they feed is a great part of fish keeping. So I would recommend that you sort of feed possibly twice a day. You would feed in the morning, so at a time to suit you when you can watch them, and then again in the early evening. For most fish, feeding twice a day is perfectly adequate, you would make sure that they're getting a regular supply of food. Now there are exceptions. There's some fish that do better if they get less frequent big meals. So some of the fish eating fish, so things, some of the small predatory live bearers, for example, some of the big cichlids, they're designed to eat a fish, and they'll swallow it and then just hold it in the stomach while it's digested. So they would eat one big meal and then digest it over several days. So those fish you would feed very differently to, say, a molly, or some of the plex, where you just feed regularly.
Yeah.
The other exception to that would possibly be fish like, or most fish fry. And fish fry are obviously, they're very, very active. The metabolism is very high, and they need a regular supply of food. In the wild, they're generally, you generally get fish breeding when there's loads and loads of food around, and the fry just swim around almost eating continually. So if you've got fry, you're probably looking at feeding probably 4 or 5 times a day. And again, that's still possible. If you work, you can feed them very first thing in the morning, a little bit when you go, it's before you go to work, some when you come home, and then mid or late evening, and just keep but cut right back on the amount you feed. And that's true with most fish. If you feed them once a day, they'll eat more in this short period of time, and what they can get inside them, they'll eat a lot more than if you feed them 3 or 4 times a day.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense. If you're feeding more often and you're feeding this, a larger amount more often, it's just going to cause problems. That leads me on to my next question, actually, was how much you feed your fish. I guess, from what you've just said, how much really depends on how often.
It does. I mean, there is the age-old recommendation that you feed your fish as much as they'll consume in. It always used to be a few minutes. On the fish science packs, we recommend a minute. So just feed your fish. If you're feeding flakes or granules or pellets, feed them on as much as they'll eat in just 1 minute, and feed them a couple of times a day on that. The aim with that is to make sure that there's nothing left. So what you want the fish to be doing is actively feeding, eating everything you put in the tank, and then they're not bloated and overfilled. They'll be able to digest it properly and make most use of the nutrients. There's a couple of things to obviously just follow on from that. One of them is if you add tablets or wafers or bigger blocks of food, they're not going to eat it all in a minute.
Yes.
So there, just make sure the fish are active and actively feeding until everything's gone. So if it was a wafer, for example, they can last, maybe 30 minutes in the tank, and the fish will be grazing continually over that 30-minute period. If after 30 minutes they've lost interest and they're all swimming away from it, but you've just got the wafer left there, then that's too much. So the next time, just use half a wafer perhaps, and just reduce it down.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of how much to feed, the other interesting thing is, like we said before, if you feed once a day, you'll find that in that minute they'll eat, maybe a big pinch of flake. If you fed them 5 times a day, they'd probably only eat a tiny portion of flake. So it's important that you adjust to how often you're feeding. And the reason it's important to just take care is the dry foods, the commercially available foods, there's not a lot of water in them. So if the example I always give is, if you think of a bloodworm, a pinch of bloodworms looks quite a lot, but actually most of the bloodworms are water. There's probably 80% of a bloodworm is made up of water. Right. So the fish eats it, but there's not a lot there. Most of it, they'll just they sort of crush the bloodworm and the water comes out, and there's very little actual food goes into them. A similar amount of a flake would be an awful lot of food, because there's only about 6 to 8% moisture. So it's well over 10 times as concentrated. So it's important, particularly with the dry foods, that you don't overfeed.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what's the worst situation if you are overfeeding? What kind of signs would you find in your aquarium if you were overfeeding your fish?
I mean, unfortunately, the worst sign that you would find is dead fish. Overfeeding the fish, the problems you get are twofold. One is any food that's not eaten will just sort of float around, will go into the filter, will start to decompose, and will result in raised levels of ammonia and nitrite. And both of those things are toxic to the fish. So if you have lots of uneaten food, then you're likely to have the nitrogen cycle working, but making the poisonous ammonia and nitrite. So all of the symptoms of ammonia poisoning and nitrite poisoning can be a result of overfeeding. So ultimately, that could be the death of the fish. It could also be the fish gasping, clamped fins, irritation, certainly going off their feed. And obviously, if they go off their feed, that compounds the whole thing, because the next time you feed, they'll eat even less, and there'll be more uneaten food in the tank. The other issue is, if you feed, and there's a lot of scientific sort of work being done, if you feed the fish on a tiny amount of food, you'll find that they'll eat it all, they'll digest it all very efficiently, and they'll absorb a lot of that food. So, you might feed a gram of food, and 90% of that they'll be able to absorb and get into their body. If you feed, let's say, 5 grams of food, that's more than the fish can cope with, and they'll still eat. They're a bit like a bit like us. If you see something that tastes really nice and you just overeat, the first bit that goes in, they digest well, but as you continue to gorge, so the latter bits of food just don't get digested very effectively. So you might end up with only half of it being digested, and the rest just passes through undigested and creates problems in the tank.
Mm-hmm.
So the vast majority of issues are down to down to the waste food and the nitrogen cycle. Mm-hmm. And of course, more work for you. If you put too much food in, you end up having to clean the filter, you end up encouraging algae, you end up just with all sorts of problems with the wrong balance in your tank, too much nitrite, too much phosphate, too much ammonia.
Definitely. So, obviously it's essential that you remove any leftover food straight away.
I guess it is, but if you're doing it properly, there shouldn't be uneaten food. So I would always suggest that you start with a little bit of food, and then the next time, if they've eaten it all really quickly, then the next time you add a little bit more. And if they eat it all really quickly, then the next time add a little bit more. So you gradually build up to the amount. I would recommend that very, very strongly over putting a great big pinch of food in and finding they only eat half of it and then having to scoop around and try and take the balance out. So if you're doing it properly, there shouldn't be uneaten food in the tank.
Absolutely.
Now, of course, that always, there's always times when that doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. It might be, you let your kids feed the fish, or you put something different in, or you feed the normal amount and the fish are just off for some other reason, and you end up getting food.
You're not there.
Yes.
I'm well aware of.
Yeah.
So I guess that set yourself a rule that you feed and you stand and observe the fish until the food's gone. And it's beneficial for yourself because you get the one of the best parts about fish keeping is watching them eat the food.
Absolutely, and the situation should be that the fish are active. There's more fish. When you look at unhealthy fish, most of the fish are, where feeding is concerned, are affected by overfeeding rather than underfeeding. Mm-hmm. In the past, I've done lots of dissections on fish, goldfish, koi, tropical fish, and I would say the majority of them have big deposits of fat in the body, and that's simply because we overfeed them. And the fish don't know that they're going to get another feed, so they always take advantage of the food that's there. And if then there's some more food comes, so they lay down the layers of fat for a rainy day, as it were, when there's no food, which would happen in the wild. So, underfeeding, I can probably count on one hand the number of times I've seen normal fish, fish that have been feeding, but fish that die through underfeeding. But there's hundreds, thousands of cases every year where people overfeed, lose the fish, particularly people new to the hobby. They overfeed, cause the water pollution, lose their fish, maybe try again, do the same thing, lose their fish, and then they leave. They think fish keeping's horrible, hard to do, and they leave the hobby. So it's just that knowledge of just aim low, just don't overfeed them. They'll always tell you they want more food. They're a bit like we've got Labradors. They're just the same. We could feed them every 5 minutes, I'm sure, right the way through the day. But they would end up overweight and unhealthy. And fish are just the same.
Yeah,
the same.
Right. Okay. And just a question that's popped up here from a Mark Farragher. I'll pop that on the screen for you, Dave, because it's quite relevant to right now. And you might be familiar with this yourself. Most food containers say as much as they can eat in 2 minutes, which to Mark makes no sense. Is that a good guideline, or is it a generic?
No, it's a guideline. I would err on the amount they'll eat in 1 minute. Some companies recommend as much as the fish will eat in a few minutes. or some like you've got there, say 2 minutes. The reason why it's difficult to say feed 1 pinch of food or feed 4 pellets or what have you is, firstly, you don't know what's in the tank, so you need to allow for whatever there is in the tank. Somebody might pick the pot of food up and have a tank with 1 fish in it, or they might have a tank with 100 fish in. So you've got to allow for the different numbers.
Yeah.
And if you say for every 10 fish feed this amount, there are times, depending if the temperature's higher, if the fish are bigger, that they'll eat more or less. So this 2-minute rule, as Mark suggested, or the 1 minute rule, as we've been talking about, just allows you to fluctuate depending on the condition of the fish.
Yeah. Well, I'm just looking. We've got, your krill flake. It says, I don't know if you can see. There's no chance. It says within 1 minute on yours, and on this one here from JBL, it says within a few minutes at the back. Yeah. So it's quite a wide guidance, like you were saying, but it is guidance, I suppose.
It's down to us. As Mark's quite right. It is vague. There's a few vague rules within fish keeping, but they tend to be vague because what we're feeding varies so much. You could have cichlids that'll eat an awful lot. You could have fish that are very timid and only pick at the food, and you've got to make allowance for both in the guidelines. So that few minutes it's a rough. It's just a guidance, just to say, if after a couple of minutes there's food left in the tank, then you've probably added a little bit too much and reduce the amount next time.
Mm-hmm. What about things like shrimps and snails? They're very good, are very handy for picking up leftover food that's made its way into places that you wouldn't normally get the gravel cleaner to. Is it possible to add enough shrimps and snails to cope with additional food so that you're, feeding too much isn't a problem? Or
that's a great point, actually, because you can very often you're advised to have like almost a mop-up crew, aren't you, in the bottom of the tank, which would be some of the Corydorus, would be shrimps and snails. Certainly if there are bits of food that go to the bottom, then yes, they'll mop it up. But if it's too much, then they can't cope with it all. So I wouldn't feed lots of food on the basis of making sure there's something left for the snails and the shrimps and the catfish. I would suggest better than doing that would be to add food specifically for them, and foods that you get down to the bottom that they can feed on.
Right. Okay.
Again, is easy to say, is difficult to do, because it's really difficult to put a food in and expect the shrimps to eat it and the guppies or the Corydorus or whatever to ignore it. So you do have that issue, but I'd just be really careful. Things like shrimps are very sensitive to poor water conditions, so more so than fish, or more so than many species of fish. So if you're adding a little bit more food to make sure there's some left for the shrimps, if you go slightly over the top there, the shrimps are going to be the first ones that are affected badly, and they would be the first ones that you would lose. So
I think
just be wary.
If you've got shrimp in the same tank as fish, you can't really. Well, I suppose you could in a sense, but it's difficult to target feed the shrimp on their own. When you're choosing to have shrimp in a tank with fish, I think the only way to feed the shrimp is to really just feed the fish, and the shrimp pick up what's left. And because shrimp have got a good way of picking up their own food off any surfaces, the things that grow up, plant or bogwood, they pick away at that all day and all night, so they pull their own food from elsewhere.
I think you're right, and they would eat that biofilm that forms on all the structures in the tank. I think the other thing, I guess 2 points. One would be if you have got sort of timid fish that are suitable to keep with shrimps, then what you can do is to feed with either little sticks or wafers or pellets that the fish can't consume straight away, and the shrimps can't, so they graze on it. So they kind of all got chance to actually have a go and get some food. And the other point linked to that would be, if you've got shrimps, you've got to avoid the more aggressive feeders, because otherwise they're going to eat the shrimps as well. So, you'd have to tailor the mix of fish and shrimps to make sure that they'll happily survive together. And as such, they'll a lot of the tiny little rasboras and the tetras and what have you that you would keep with shrimps, they tend to be very, very picky. They'll pick at little bits of food and take it in their mouth and spit it out, chew it and spit it out. And those little bits will be bits that the shrimps will feed on.
Yeah, definitely. It's just like anything else, trial and error, and keeping an eye on it. If you're setting up an aquarium, you've got an idea of what you want it, what you're aiming for, so you feed accordingly. If it's a shrimp species tank, then you'll pick up foods that are specifically for shrimps, and there's different ways that you can do that. You can just sprinkle it in, or you can use a little dish, or when it's just shrimp, it's a different thing altogether. But when you're feeding the fish and shrimp, you've got to monitor both ends of it, and obviously make sure, like you said, make sure both are getting what they need.
That's true. And also what you can do if you've got, and it might not be shrimp, it may be some other sort of timid fish, some of the catfish, for example, some of the L numbers are really reluctant to feed when you've got the lights on and when the other fish are active. So sometimes what you've got to do is to put some of the wafer type foods, or some of the a tablet or something, but put it in after the lights have been switched off, so the rest of the fish will stop feeding, and that leaves those sort of night feeders to have a chance of actually getting some of the food that's in there.
That leads me on to Alan's question. Does it matter if the aquarium lights are on or off when feeding? Thinking about lights on a timer to be on when you're at home, mostly for the plants. So, you just mentioned having the lights off there, so I'll pop that one up. It's a good timing.
It's perfect. Yeah. The only reason for suggesting feeding when the lights are off is if you've got fish that are not are timid and won't feed actively when the bright lights are on. For the majority of fish we keep, they'll feed whenever the food goes in. So, and as I said right at the start, I think for me, certainly feeding the fish is your way of interacting with them. So it would be better to either have the lights on or have the room lights on, or just so you can see what's happening, and you can actually enjoy watching them feeding. So for me, I would feed wherever possible. I would feed when the lights are on, so that you can actually see that the feeding and what have you. But there would be no issue for the fish if the room lights are on and you put some food in, they'd eat it. It's not for them that's recommended. It's more just for you, and making sure that you get the chance to see the fish feeding, and that it's nice to see them feeding, but also if you're feeding them when the lights are on, you see the fish, that's your chance to check them out, make sure there's no obvious diseases or any signs that they're not behaving as they should do, which is your first clue that there might be a problem in the tank.
Definitely. One thing I'll say on the light topic though is, with my saltwater aquarium, if I've got the lights off, all the fish hide inside the rocks. I don't know if there are different temperaments with them being ocean fish, theoretically. When the sun sets in the ocean, they need to hide for bigger predators. It's an instinct thing. So I don't find anything feeds other than snails and shrimps when the lights are off in my saltwater aquarium, but completely different from a freshwater, I'd imagine.
In a way it is, but there's certainly some of the L numbers and some of the catfish and some of the gouramis that really are nervous. If you've got bright light, they don't like it. What you've got the option of doing in a freshwater tank, and I guess you have in a marine tank, is with the planting and with the landscaping, you can actually create areas that are not brightly lit, and that's obviously where these fish would tend to accumulate. That's where they'd be happy feeding.
Yeah.
So even in a brightly lit tank, if you've got dense plant cover in some areas, you can make sure that there's some food goes somewhere near there. And then if you've got fish that are a little bit nervous and reluctant to feed, that you're actually getting food to them so they can have a go at it. But what certainly what I've noticed, and in the tanks that I've always had, you'll find if a fish is hungry, it'll feed. So if you might not see it feed, but you'll find that the fish always, the fish will look in good condition, as long as they're not looking hollow bellied and not looking healthy. They're generally managing to find some food somewhere, and gradually fish are, they're very much not daft creatures. They'll learn pretty quickly that when you lift the lid, there's food to be had. So they be, even the bottom feeders come off the bottom to try and get the flake at the surface or the pellets before everything else gets it. So you'll find they pretty quickly learn where food comes from and go and get it.
Yeah. Do you think fish recognize specific people as feeders? Fish see my daughter coming into the aquarium, they swim away to the but when I go over, they tend to go up to you, like you say, to get ready to feed.
It's a good. I don't know. Fish can certainly recognize different colors or different shades, different tones of color, and they can definitely recognize, different vibrations. So there'll be certain actions that you might do. You won't go running up to the tank. You sort of gently go up to the tank. You open the lid. You put the food in, and all that sort of gentle routine that they're used to means feeding. Whereas if somebody, I'm not saying that your daughter will do this, but if somebody dashes up and knocks on the tank and then bangs around a little bit, then that's not the routine they're used to, and there's some alarm signals there, and they'll be more reluctant.
Yeah.
So I'd say normally, if somebody mimicked you, I don't think the fish will be able to tell that it was you or somebody different. But I'm sure there'll be people, out there that'll say, no, you're wrong. They can recognize me. And I can't say that that's not the case, but
there's no way, I suppose.
No, I mean, I'm sure that we could do some great experiments to try and find out if they could do that, but it's not something. It's not something that I know of. I couldn't give you proof that they can recognize. They recognize me and not you, or vice versa.
Okay. Right. A question I've got here is just one of my own questions: is how often should you feed your fish live foods?
That live foods are a great food to give your fish. But I would suggest, under normal circumstances, that they're a food that you would feed on an irregular basis. So maybe 2 or 3 times a week under normal circumstances. The reason for suggesting that is firstly, fish love it. If you put live foods in, they go nuts for it. They're swimming around actively. They're grabbing the live food. They're eating it, and it's fantastic to see. But the live foods, as we mentioned already, are relatively low in food, and there's a lot of water in there, and also they're relatively low in the nutritional mix that the fish need. If you imagine, I don't know, a rosy barb or a regal tang or whatever, but pretty much any fish in the wild, they'd feed on a whole range of different food organisms. So rosy barb might be feeding on several different species of Daphnia, on copepods, on worms, on insect larvae, on algae, on new shoots, on little snails, on there'd be a whole range of different foods, and that mix in the wild would give them the balanced diet that they need to thrive, be healthy, grow, reproduce, what have you. By feeding live food, all you're doing is taking one of that multitude of foods and feeding that. So you're only giving them a small part of their nutritionally balanced diet. So live foods are great in terms of they encourage the fish, they give them a treat, you can help to condition the fish with them, but I don't think they should be the standard part of a diet in an aquarium or a pond, because you're just not giving enough of a mix.
Yeah. So could you do it every day but back it up with dry foods throughout the day?
Yeah, absolutely you could. There would be no problem at all. I think that the benefit of the commercially prepared diets is that they are a mix of a whole range of different ingredients, and ingredients that have been carefully selected to make sure that you've got that balance of protein, carbohydrates, minerals, vitamins, fat, oils. It's a balanced diet. Whereas if you've got a lot of live foods, then you're adding one part of the diet and you have to balance it with the rest. There's obviously risks, and they're well sort of written about risks of introducing disease by using live foods. And I think that would be the case if you were, if you went out in the wild or into a pond that had other fish and actually scooped around and caught live foods from the wild. There is a risk you could introduce diseases or predators into your tank.
Yeah.
Most of the live foods that we purchase from a shop are cultured. So they won't have been, in the majority of cases, they won't have been in touch with a lot of fish. So you should be perfectly okay with them.
Okay. Right, I've got a question here from a good friend, the Lothian Fishkeepers group, Harrison Summit. I'll just pop this up for you. This is slightly different from what we're talking about. And it goes, how many days can you leave them without fish, without food? For example, going on holidays. I see people discuss this topic, every year. Some people say that, you can feed a good feed before you go. Some people say that you need somebody to come in and feed them every day. But what would you suggest?
But I mean, let's start from the beginning. So if you're going on holiday a week from now, then what I would suggest that you would do is you would feed the fish normally up to the point that you go away on holiday. I wouldn't recommend at all adding more food in that period before you go away, just so that you build them up ready to go away. The problem with you doing that is your fish and your are used to consuming and digesting a certain amount of food. If suddenly you increase that amount of food, then there'll be more that'll be uneaten or less that'll be digested, and that will add pressure to the filter and could cause issues with raised ammonia and nitrite. And the last thing you want to happen when you're not there is there to be raised ammonia and nitrite in the tank, leading to fish being unhealthy. Maybe you lose one fish, but because you're not there, that dead fish stays in the tank, pollutes the water, and you end up with a disaster. So just feed normally. Don't try and bulk the food up. If you remember, I said when we used to do lots of fish dissections, the fish have always got big fat reserves. So you don't need to bulk them up. They've got it. You're feeding more than they actually need to survive most of the time. So they're in that position to be able to survive for a few days without anything. If you were just going away for a couple of days, then again, there would be no need to do anything. Don't do anything major in the day or so before you go, because you don't want to change anything. You want the tank just to be balanced and just run smoothly. And that goes with the feeding. So get up to the time you go. Don't feed just before you leave. Just feed normally. Go away, come back, and the fish will be fine. You'll probably find the tank will be nice and clean because they'll have cleared off all the algae and they'll have through anything that's on the bottom. So it'll all be fine. If you are going away for longer than that, then there are holiday foods that you can get. We do a weekend food. There are holiday blocks, and they work. They provide a little bit of food that generally is released over a period of time, so the fish have got something to pick on, and that's fine. I would say if you did nothing, your fish could probably survive without any issues for between 5 and 6 days.
Right.
They've easily got enough nutrients in them and in the tank to survive that long.
Okay.
The issue you've got when you're away on holiday is that something goes wrong. The last thing you want is a fish to die and pollute the water, a power cut to stop the filter, the heater to break. So having somebody go in, maybe twice a week is a great idea. Just go in, just check that everything's working okay. And if you ask them then to feed the fish, great, you're feeding them every couple of days and you just keep them going, and then the fish will survive for 2 weeks really, really easily. Just be careful though, because fish keepers instinctively know how much feed to give. We've talked about this 1 minute or 2 minute rule. If you get somebody just a helpful next door neighbor to come in and feed, they invariably don't, unless they keep fish, they won't know how much to feed. And you say a pinch of flake, and a pinch of flake suddenly becomes, a great big wad of food that goes in, and you can have the overfeeding problems. So what I would normally do is either suggest feeding tablets when you're away, and just tell your neighbour 1 tablet, 2 tablets, or 1 tablet and a wafer. So you're really precise in what they need to do. Or what some people do is they get the little pill boxes and just put the food that's needed in each of the compartments, so the person can actually feed that amount.
That's quite clear.
Well, the other thing you've got are the automatic feeders, and again, they're great. But I would when you're away, err on underfeeding. The last thing you want to do is have too much food in the tank, because you're not there to check on it. So really go on the amount they'd probably eat in 30 seconds. When you're away, you're not aiming to get them to grow. You're not aiming to do anything. You're just aiming to them in maintenance mode. They're just going to survive and be healthy and happy till you come back.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, there's lots of ways of doing it, but just a little bit of food on on an infrequent basis when you're away is perfect.
Okay. What about Carl Robertson? He's been on aquariumscience.org, and it says there that you should only feed the size of a fish's eye per day. Never seen it described like that before, but
no, I haven't. I mean, it's what they're trying to do is to really focus you in on the fact that you don't overfeed. So they're probably not a million miles away. The difficulty is, if it's a pellet or if it's flake, it's quite difficult to judge. Flakes tend to be quite not very dense, so you can get quite a lot of flake would have the same amount of food as a small dense pellet. So it's difficult to judge exactly, but I can see exactly what aquarium science are trying to do. It's just to focus you in on the fact that don't feed very much.
Yeah.
Size of a fish's eye gives you something to visualize when you're actually doing it.
And obviously, the bigger the fish, the bigger the eye. So
yes, yeah, and the more fish, the more eyes you've got to take into account. So it's the
calculator.
Yeah, and that's where I'd come back to this 1 minute rule. It's just an easy rule to follow. You put the amount in, watch them for it. If it's 50 seconds or if it's 2 minutes. In reality, it doesn't matter, so long as the fish are actively feeding on the food until it's all gone. That's the key to it.
Yeah, and again, you're just watching. Personally, I like to just sprinkle a little bit, and then once it's gone, I put a little bit more in, and then that's it. And then I'll go back later on and take it easy that way.
Yeah, and I think if you're feeding little bits of food, very often we're all in that situation, aren't we, where you would normally feed first thing in the morning, kind of when you get home from work in the evening, and that's your routine. That's when you feed them. But then you get visitors come round in the afternoon, and they're all looking at the tank, and you want to show off your tank, so you put a little bit of food in. And again, that's no issue at all. Just put a little bit of food in, and then probably feed a little bit less when you would normally feed in the evening, or even miss out the evening food. So the fact that you normally feed twice a day, 9 and 6, for example, 9 o'clock and 6 o'clock, doesn't mean that you can't swap it and feed 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock, or 9 o'clock and 8 o'clock. It really doesn't matter.
Yeah. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put up a question from Conor. I mentioned at the start of the broadcast that Conor was meant to join us this evening, but he was unable to, but he sent over some questions. I've got 2 questions for him. I'll answer one just now, and then we can come back to the second one just before we finish up for the evening. So here we go. Conor Hines is asking, what food is best for certain fish families, such as catfish, plecos, and corridors? Is there, do these fish groups have a certain type of food that's best specifically for them? What would you advise each kind of fish food? or fish group?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question to answer because the fish families are so wide. So if you looked at Corydorus, just as an example, and there are some species that are very finicky, and you may well have to have a significant portion of live food in there just to get them to feed properly. You've got others that like slightly more vegetable matter in the diet, some that are perhaps more scavengers, and exactly the same is true with plex. So, you know, the food would vary depending on the species rather than the family. But what I would certainly say is with all of the fish he's talked about, they're all bottom feeders. So you need food that gets down to them. You know, it's pointless having a floating food because they might get to it eventually, but they want it on the bottom where they can actually feed in a natural way. In terms of fish like the plex, and they'd be a great example. Plex can be anything from the vegetable eating, you know, algae and vegetable eating Ancistrus, all the way through to the wood eating Panax, to the scavenging, some of the bigger plex that would actively feed on dead fish in the wild. You know, they scavenge on whatever there is on the bottom. So you've got a complete difference in what those fish would eat, and you'd have to amend the diet accordingly. So if you were talking about, you know, the Ancistrus, the bristle noses, lemons and reds and what have you, they're largely algae eating species, and algae wafers are a perfect way of feeding them. If you're looking at Panax, then again, they like a vegetable and wood-based diet. So something like the oak and algae wafers that we've produced provide that woody element to the diet. Whereas if it's some of the more specialist plex, those that are scavengers, you've probably got to add something. You probably use the wafers, but you would supplement it perhaps with little bits of fish in some cases, or worms or what have you, to try and recreate that slightly different diet. So the thing certainly is to read up about the fish and look at what sort of diet they would normally eat in the wild and where they would normally eat it. And then you can try and recreate that in the diet that you're giving them in an aquarium.
And that's another fun part about fish keeping is, you know, trying to recreate that natural environment for them as close as possible.
Absolutely, it is. Yeah, and there's so many different ones. I mean, I'm sure people would be able to quote the numbers, but there are dozens of species of Corydorus that are kept in captivity, and they won't all eat exactly the same food. You know, we have what we call a Corydorus tablet, which is a great mixed diet for the insect-eating, algae-eating cories. But there will be some specialist cories that are much more adapted to a specific diet that would only form part of the diet. You'd need to supplement it.
Yeah, and again, that's research.
It is, and you should do that before you buy the fish. That's what's always recommended, and it's a good idea. You know, ask the shop. The store owners would normally know what fish they've got and would know a little bit about what to feed them on. And you can also, you know, do some research before you go and be looking for a particular species and know what it feeds on, know what water conditions it needs, know what tank mates it would live with.
Yeah, sorry. The best part about doing that research is you find out things like what type of wood that they would, you know, graze on in the wild. You can find out what type of plant, not just the fact that they will eat plants, but not all fish eat all plants. There's a lot of plants out there that fish won't touch. So, you know, without that research, you can't give the fish the correct food. You know, there's oxygen weed. You know, that's a big one that gets eaten by a lot of fish.
Yes.
But then Anubias, I don't know any fish that eats Anubias. They'll eat the algae that, you know, quite often grows on it, but they don't eat the actual leaf. So, you know, without that research, you could be putting in these plants and nothing happens. You know, you're wondering why your fish are not eating the plants. It says it eats plants, but you know, thorough research is always advised.
Yeah.
And even more so these type of fish, because they are quite specialist in the sense of their diets and environment.
Yeah, and sometimes that, you know, the research might be online. Sometimes it's just speaking to people that keep the sort of fish that you're interested in. I mean, the oak and algae wafers that we've got is an interesting example of that, where the we use oak bark in the food to provide that woody material that the panax and picoltias like. It provides the tannins, it provides the roughage that they need for their digestive systems to work. But interestingly, the idea of oak bark came from somebody who I was speaking to, who used to, or probably still does, get branches of oak with the bark on it, and he just used to put them in the tank with his panax, and they would graze all the bark off these branches and then sort of back away from the branches. They wouldn't eat them anymore, and he would just throw them away and put another thing in. So they obviously like the oak bark, and that kind of triggers some ideas then of what you could actually include. So it's not just a chunk of oak or a chunk of sycamore or a chunk of pine that you want to throw in there. It's certain types of wood that they actually like better than others.
Yeah, I mean, the same thing applies to shrimps as well. One of our friends, Jordan, aquaplanter, he's watching on YouTube. He's just put a comment up saying that amano shrimps can eat 8R mini, which is a species of aquatic plant that a lot of aquascapers use. Most, it's more common for like your cherry shrimps and these type of ones to really just kind of eat dead plants or dying plants, or even just eat the biofilm that grows on top. But amano shrimps, I've never experienced that, but Jordan, he's a big fan of amano shrimps, and he's obviously witnessed that in his own aquariums where they actively eat that species of plant. So if you're looking to create a lovely looking aquascape and you're choosing that plant and you're putting those shrimps in, you're going to end up in a situation where two things that you thought would live in harmony are actually causing problems.
That's true. Yeah, you end up with a hole in your aquascape because of the shrimps.
Yeah. So yeah, again, research is just research.
Yeah, and more so probably for the more unusual fish species.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the majority of us keep fairly basic fish. They always called community fish, but there are certain fish that are the readily available ones, and the knowledge on those fish is second to none. You can get loads of information online. Your local store can tell you, your local aquarist society can tell you all you need to know. But once you've kept them for a while, then people sometimes branch off and go to more unusual fish, and that's where you really do have to start doing the research and asking around and getting advice and chats to other people that are catfish specialists, for example, or live bearer specialists, or anabantoid specialists are great. They can give you that extra information that's essential.
Definitely. I guess fish clubs and even Facebook and these kind of platforms are brilliant for reaching out to people that keep these type of fish to get advice. It's vital that people take advantage of these platforms and clubs to learn, I suppose.
Yeah, and hopefully, we're in a strange time at the moment, aren't we, where fish clubs can't actually meet. So a lot of the fish club activities are going on online, which opens that up to anybody that wants to take note and to join in.
Yeah.
So I think the online fish keeping communities getting bigger and bigger and stronger, and there's more information being exchanged. The interesting thing there, though, and it's true with all aspects of fish keeping, is there's probably no right answer. Everybody wants the right answer, but there's usually several right answers to what to feed, what you keep them, how you keep them, how you breed them. People can be successful doing slightly different things, and you can end up with almost conflicting advice online, and you just need to question that in your own mind, make sure that you're not doing something silly.
Yeah.
You've got a herbivorous fish, for example, it might eat a fish rich diet, but it's not going to thrive on it because that's not what it eats normally. So you've got to sort of judge what you're reading based on common sense and a little bit of background reading on the fish.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's research. It always comes down to research.
Yeah.
I've only got one more question, bringing us back to the subject of food. And it's really just a general question about the food itself. And I want to know if dry food, like flake food, more flake food, does that lose nutrition over time? I've read, I can't remember where I read it, but I did read somewhere that when you've got flake food and it breaks up and crumbles down, it loses, I think it was the vitamin C. It affects the vitamin C levels in the actual flake if it's getting broken up. So, when your fish food is sitting in a tub for months, does it, slowly lose its potency over that time, or am I way off?
No, you're not. You're absolutely right. The foods, when we make a food, the food is made, and you have to put on the pack the amount of vitamins that are in there, the minerals that are in there. You've got to give an analysis that says what the benefits of the food will be. That's true of the food when it's opened, and it's true up to the best before date. So if you've got a best before date on the fish science food, it's 3 years. As long as that pack of food is is unopened and is stored in a cool place, then the food will be as good after 3 months. After 3 years as it is when it was manufactured, and it will meet up with all the requirements, all the specification on the pack. As soon as you open the pack, then the degradation of the food starts. And what happens there is that you get moisture and you get oxygen going into the food. So if you look on the pack of any commercial food, you'll find that the moisture level is really low. It's usually somewhere between 6, 8, 10%, that sort of level. And as such, as soon as you open the food and you expose it to moisture in the air, it just acts like a sponge and absorbs the moisture. And once the moisture's in the food, then bacteria and fungi spores that will be in the air and in the moisture will start to develop and will grow on the food. So if you open the food in near your aquarium where it's very humid, you'll get a lot of humidity into the food, and it'll start to break down quite quickly.
Right.
Oxygen also causes problems, and oxygen certainly is one of the problems for vitamin C. So if you expose the food to oxygen, which is in the air, then the vitamin C can be denatured. And the finer the particles of food, the more surface area and the better the oxygen is able to access it. So if you had big flakes of food or big pellets, then the center of the pellet will be relatively isolated from any oxygen. But if it's a really fine powder, of course, the oxygen can get all the way around the powder and really start to attack the vitamin C. If you add to that, you've got a tub of food, you open it, and then you put your fingers in and feed the fish, and then a day later you put your fingers in and feed the fish. You're contaminating the food with bacteria and fungi, and they also can take advantage of the food as it becomes moister and moister. The answer, if we say that the best before date on a food is 3 years, what we're saying is it'll last 3 years if it's kept unopened. As soon as you open the food, you can't guarantee a best before date, and you could get a food to go off in as little as 24 hours, or you could get it to last for probably 6 to 8 months. If you expose it to a lot of humidity, it'll go off really quickly. I've seen examples with the foods when I'm at shows, for example, hobbyist shows, where I try and show the foods and I'll tip maybe the wafers into the lid and show people the actual food. And over the space of about 12 hours of the show, some of the wafers can increase in size by about a third. And it's just as they're absorbing the moisture, because there's usually aquaria around and water. So that could easily happen if you left the lid off, for example. The best thing to do in terms of storing the food to get the maximum out of it, I'd suggest a couple of things. One is buy the amount of food that you're going to use generally in 2 to 3 months.
Right.
So if you've got a small tank, buy a small pot. If you've got a big tank, buy a big pot. But don't kind of buy a great big pot because it's good. Yeah, exactly. If you bought a great big pot like that and you've only got one fish, it's going to last for years.
It's probably better.
And that's that's certainly the case. But what you could do, obviously some of the big pots are much better value. So what you can do is to buy the big pot, open it, and decant some of the food into a smaller pot. And then rather than just sealing the big pot, just put some polythene over the top of the food, or sometimes better still even is pour it into the grip seal bags and seal them. So sort of gently squash the air out, seal them, and then put them back into the pot so that they're away from sunlight, they're away from moisture, they're away from oxygen, and use what's in the pot and then refill it and just keep refilling on a regular basis. Some people have asked, should they put it in the fridge? And there's certainly no harm in putting dry fish food in the fridge, but so long as you don't expose it to temperatures over sort of 25, 26, 27 degrees or bright sunlight, then it's fine. Just in a cool, dark cupboard is perfect.
Okay.
So, you're absolutely right. That as soon as you've opened it, the finer the powder, the quicker it'll go off. But you can do things to mitigate against that.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing I would take from that is definitely don't go over the top when you're buying your food. Think along the lines on the same kind of mentality of what do you feed your fish. You don't put in a big pile of fish, a big pile of food in the tank. You spread it out. So it's common sense, really.
It is, and it's just being aware that moisture and oxygen are the two enemies of fish food. Mm-hmm. And moisture is one thing that's in abundance. If you've got an aquarium or a pond, it's just there. It's a day-by-day problem, so you've just got to be careful with it.
Could you keep fish food, dried fish food, in a freezer?
You could do. I don't think there's any need to, but it would do no harm. Okay. There would be no issue with doing it. The fridge is the same. It helps because it's cool and it's dark, and that's what you're looking for. But you don't need to keep it at 4 degrees and permanently dark. You can keep it at 15, 18 degrees just in the cupboard under the aquarium where it's nice and cool and is dark.
Yeah.
One thing, and it's probably not for aquarium fish foods, but for pond fish foods, sunlight can be an issue. So if you get bright sunlight and it falls on your fish food, it will damage the vitamins on the bits of food that the sunlight actually touches, and it can also bleach the food, so it will actually make it change color.
It can actually bleach the food,
just in terms of a bit like it's just the UV in the sunlight can actually take the colorants out of the food. So you might have a food that's normally a reddy color, for example, and it would just make it go either very pale or even get rid of the red altogether and just go to a beigey color.
Do you think that would affect the food's ability to produce better color in the fish?
It definitely would on the bits that are affected.
Yeah.
The thing to remember though is if say you had it in a clear bucket, we put our pond foods in a clear bucket. If you put those out in the sun, the bit of the food that's right next to the outside of the bucket will be exposed to the sun and could be impacted by it. But the food that's a pellet further in from that outer layer isn't coming into contact with the light, so would be fine. It's only where the light actually hits, which is it's a minimal amount of that food.
Right. Okay. I think we'll have no more questions, so I'm just looking through the comments. We've pulled out a few good questions so far. And there's one here from Ollie Saunders. Sorry, I'll just pop that up on screen, David, if you want to answer that one. It's one I think we kind of touch on this every time we come on, but it's always good to recap and kind of elaborate on where you are with this one.
Yeah, this one is is produced, is labelled, is packed, and is on its way to us. We've got a South American pelleted food. It's not like the Vibra Bites, which are sort of a long, thin, worm-like pellet that Hikari have produced. This one's a 5 mil by 2.5 mil pellet, so it's perfect for the bigger South American cichlids.
Right.
For the smaller guys, we've got, so for the rams and the cribs and what have you, we do the worm pellets and we do the normal tropical granules, and both of those are small sinking pellets. But for the bigger fish, we didn't have anything, so we've now got this slightly bigger pelleted food, and it's that one. It'll be called, I think it's floating cichlid pellets.
Right.
It's insect meal, it's got worm meal, it's got shrimp and krill, a little bit of herring meal in it. The trial results were really good. A number of people helped us and checked it out, and it came back with some great comments.
Brilliant.
So we'll just start selling that, and we should have it in the UK next week, I would guess, and then it'll get out to the wholesalers and out to the shops probably in the next couple of weeks after that.
Okay.
We'll put something on Facebook definitely as soon as we have it. We'll put some on Facebook. We'll do some competitions so people can trial it and comment on it for us.
Fantastic. There was only one other question from Jane Handley, and she was really, this is an off-topic question, and she wanted to know if beginners can contact you directly on Facebook to find out what the best food for their fish would be.
Of course they can. Yeah, I can cope with a certain number of questions, but yeah, no problem at all. And it's always interesting because it's easier to let people know what to feed rather than have them feeding something and then finding it doesn't work and then they have to slowly swap over. So yeah, I've got no issue at all. If people want to contact us on Facebook, let us know what fish they keep, what fish they're thinking of keeping, and we'll give them some advice on which of the fish science foods are the best ones for it. And if we haven't got anything, I'm well aware that fish science isn't the only food on the market. There are other foods. If we haven't got something that's appropriate, then we'll recommend something different.
Yeah.
It's the fish that's important.
Well, that's it. That's all. It was always about the fish. Jane's actually got another bit of advice. She mentioned this earlier on when we were talking. I'll pop that one up, and you can maybe either agree or disagree. So what she's saying is, if you choose a high protein food, which you assume would be a better, a better food for your fish, this can actually cause internal problems, especially for guppies.
Yeah, and I know Jane's an expert on keeping guppies and breeding some fantastic specimens, and protein is useful in some circumstances. It allows protein is one of the building blocks. So you use the amino acids in proteins to actually, develop muscles, develop tissue. But too high a protein can cause issues for fish. So fish have generally got a level of protein that they'll thrive on. If you're much below that, they don't grow as well as they should do. If you go way over the top, they get too much protein, which either can cause internal issues or it can result in the protein not being digested efficiently, and then you get problems with waste.
Yeah.
And I know certainly with the guppies and with a lot of the more herbivorous fish species, then having a diet that's too rich in high protein fish meals and various other animal based foods can be just too much for them.
I guess that kind of touches on a previous question where if you're only feeding your fish live food, they're only getting mainly protein. So you've got to balance that out. So again, it's the same kind of point.
It is, and I know where Jane has some issues, and I know also the goldfish keepers have similar problems in that to get the best growth and the best quality fish, you need to get them to grow pretty quickly when they're small. So when they're going from fry to juveniles to to young adults, you need to be giving them the protein to make sure that they develop well and they develop to their, to look as good as they possibly can. But there's a fine balance between getting that right and adding too much protein, where suddenly you start having issues. And goldfish are a good example. Lionhead goldfish, orandas as well, have this growth on the top of their head. And if you can put high protein food in them, then, give them high protein food, then that develops really well. But then you come to a point where you've got to ease it off to avoid them, having problems, because they're not naturally high protein food eaters. They'd normally eat a more of a herbivorous diet.
Okay. Right. Well, the last question that I have for yourself, Dave, came from Conor. This was the second question, and this is not anything to do with food, but he's one of the admin team on our group, and it's something that pops up quite often. And he just wanted to raise the question with yourself and get your point of view on these. So I'll pop that up. And he's asking, how far do you go when you're doing water changes? And also, how clean do you need your filter to be? How regularly should you be cleaning it?
Let me answer the last bit first. How clean should the filter be? You don't want the filter to be clean. The filter is there, and he's doing several jobs. The first bit is the mechanical part of the filter, and that's the bit that sieves out the big bits of debris, and that you can clean, fairly vigorously. There's no issue. That's not growing anything particularly on it. The second stage of the filter is usually the biological part of the filter. And that's where you're growing bacteria that will eat the food and the fish waste and break it down into ammonia. Then they're eating the ammonia, breaking it to nitrite, and then eating the nitrite and making it into nitrate. You don't want to clean those bacteria. If you clean that part of the filter too much, then you'll clean off all the bacteria, and you then go back into a new tank syndrome situation where you've not got enough bacteria to break down all the waste that's been produced by the fish. So I would suggest with your filter, what you're looking to do when you clean it is just to stop it blocking. So as long as the water will pass through it okay, that's fine. You don't want it to be pristine. You don't want it to be back as it was, the filter media, when you first bought it. So definitely don't use any tap water, because the chlorine and chloramine in tap water will kill the helpful bacteria.
Yeah.
Don't use any water that's got soaps or anything to really clean the filter. That you just don't want those. You want to remove the worst of the debris and leave as much of the bacteria on as possible. So just what I would recommend doing is, if you're cleaning your filter, cleaning your tank, take a bucket full of water out of the tank, and then take your filter and clean the filter media in the old tank water, and then put it all back. And that's enough. That's all you're doing, is just freeing it up and stopping it blocking.
Yeah.
In terms of how far you go with water changes, there's probably quite a bit of leeway in how far you would go. In most cases, I would say, somewhere between 10 and 25% of your water every couple of weeks, every 3 weeks, once your tank is established and is mature. But you'll find when you first start, it's probably better doing a little bit more, because inevitably when you first start in the tank, you've got raised levels of ammonia and nitrite. So doing the water change helps to dilute it and helps you to get rid of debris out of the tank. But what in an established tank, then 10%, possibly even 5%, if it's a big tank, just freshening the water up is all that you need to do. I would rarely go beyond 20-25% water changes. Again, the only time you would possibly do that is maybe when you do like a big maintenance to your tank, and that's probably once a year, once every couple of years, where you really, you take a lot of debris out of the gravel, you'll be trimming plants back, moving things around, and then you might sort of remove 50%, 60% of the water. But when you're doing that amount, you've got to be really careful with the water that's going back in, to make sure that it's dechlorinated, and also make sure that it's similar in terms of water quality to the water quality you're taking out. So you don't want a big pH swing or hardness being very, very different.
I guess there's products out there that you can put in the water that's going back into the tank, to help mature that water as quick as possible, like your bacteria. The good bacteria that you can put straight in the main tank, and you can put them, like there's gels that you can get for your filter media. There is a lot of help out there to try and maintain that balance.
That's a good point. There's two areas. One is to get rid of the chlorine, and you can add dechlorinators and things that get rid of chloramine. There's also, in those water conditioners, there are some that have protective colloids, and these are like something that will just coat the gills and just protect it from any slight changes in water quality. But you've also then got the bacterial cultures and bacterial things that encourage bacteria growth, which, if you are doing a big filter clean, or if you're doing a big water change, then adding the bacteria is a great way of just making sure you've got enough so that you don't have that new tank issue when you do the water change.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess there's nothing else for us to discuss. So unless anyone else has any other questions, I'm just checking. Nope. Nothing.
Great.
So I think we can let you go now, Dave.
Fantastic. I look forward to seeing you next week. And if anybody's got any ideas of topics they want us to cover next week, then just get in touch on Facebook or through Lothian Fishkeepers, and we'll do our best to cover it.
Absolutely. So thanks for everybody that's joined us again this evening. It's been great getting some questions of you and being able to pass on some advice. And we just look forward to next week now. Same time next week, Dave.
Fantastic. Yeah. Good night.
Right. Good night. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.